In this video, we are going to do a deep dive into variable libraries in Microsoft Fabric to learn how to make deployment smoother and eliminate those annoying manual adjustments that are needed after deployments when items and connections are pointing to a wrong place. This is a video you definitely want to watch if you are looking to improve your deployment and CI/CD processes. So stay tuned. Welcome to the video. My name is Alexi and on this channel I cover Microsoft Fabric related topics. In this video we are going to learn how to use variable libraries to remove those annoying manual adjustments that are needed after deploying solutions to another workspace using deployment pipelines. But now, without further ado, let's get started. First, let's go through the initial setup that we have here. So I have this workspace called variable library demo dev, and in that workspace I have a lakehouse, then I have a notebook, then I have a data pipeline. And we can see all those three resources in this architecture diagram as well. So we have a lakehouse, then we have a data pipeline, then we have a notebook. In that lakehouse we actually have two shortcuts. We have one table shortcut and then we have one file shortcut. The table shortcut is actually pointing to another workspace in Fabric, but the file shortcut is actually pointing to a storage account in Azure. Then in the data pipeline we have three activities. The first activity runs this data pipeline that is in the same workspace as the lakehouse that we are using for that other shortcut there. Then in the second activity we have a run notebook activity that runs the same notebook that we have in that workspace. Then lastly we have this invoke Azure Data Factory activity that invokes Azure Data Factory pipeline that is in Azure. Then in the notebook we are reading some CSV data from that other workspace. But let's quickly check out those resources that we have here. So let's start from the lakehouse. Here we can see those two shortcuts. There we have that one table shortcut. Then we have this file shortcut as well. So this table shortcut is pointing to this workspace, this animal workspace, and in this animal workspace we have a lakehouse, and here we have the table to which that shortcut is pointing. Then in the Azure we have this storage account, and in this storage account we have a container, and in that container we have those files that we can see via this source shortcut here. So I have this is dev file there, and this movie CSV file, and here we can see those files there. Then in the data pipeline we have these three activities, and this pipeline activity here is invoking pipeline in this animal workspace, and here we have that pipeline, so we just have a wait activity here, and then we are invoking a notebook, and that notebook is in the same workspace as we saw in the architecture diagram, but it is using these workspace and lakehouse IDs to use this ABFS path to read data from this animal workspace from this lakehouse here, and here we have that animal CSV file that this notebook is reading, and here we can see a print of that data. And lastly, in this data pipeline we have this invoke ADF activity that invokes data factory pipeline that we have here in Azure in this resource group. So here we have the data factory, and if we launch the studio we can see that pipeline when the studio opens, and here we can see that we have just one pipeline here and there is only one wait activity in that pipeline. So nothing really special here, but this really represents this kind of a real world scenario that you have connections going to many different places in Fabric. But yeah, let's close this data factory and let's go back to this resource group. And next we would like to deploy the contents of this variable library demo dev workspace to this variable library demo prod workspace. Then we already have these corresponding production environments populated in Azure and also in Fabric. So here we have the animals production workspace, and there we already have those items ready. Then we have the resource group for production items in Azure as well, and there we have the corresponding items there already. But this variable library demo prod workspace is empty, and now we would like to do a deployment there. And next, let's create that deployment pipeline. Let's go to deployment pipelines and let's create a new pipeline, and let's call this variable library demo. And then here we can see that we have three stages, but because I want to keep this demo simple, I will eliminate the test stage. So let's remove the test stage here. So now we only have two environments to keep things simple. And now we can click create and continue. And now we can assign workspaces to these stages. And now let's assign those workspaces to these stages. And now they have been assigned. And we should soon see that we don't have anything in the production workspace. So we can see that all the items that we have are only present in the source, but not in the destination, that is the production workspace. And now I would like to deploy those items there. So let's click deploy and let's deploy them. Soon we would have those items in the production workspace. This should be done in a moment. Now the deployment is done and both of these environments are in sync. So we have the same things in our destination than we have in the source. And now we can go to the production workspace and check it out. Here we can see that we now have these items in this workspace as well. But the situation here is not as good as it looks. For example, if we open this lakehouse, we can see that these shortcuts are actually pointing to the same place that they did in the previous workspace. And for example, this source here is still pointing to dev. I can tell this because we have this is dev file here, because in the production workspace, I would have this is prod file. So if we open the production workspace, we can see that there is this is prod file. So these shortcuts are pointing to the same place that they did in the previous workspace. Then if we go back, and we can also see that, of course, in the notebook, we have those hard-coded values that are pointing to that dev animals workspace, because this is the workspace ID and the lakehouse ID for the animals dev workspace. And then in the data pipeline, we also have these issues. If we open this data pipeline, we can see that this invoke pipeline activity is pointing to this animals dev workspace, even though I would want to point it to prod. Also, this invoke ADF pipeline is also pointing to that dev ADF. The situation after the first deployment looks like this. So we can see that we managed to deploy all those 3 items to that new workspace, but the connections of those items are still pointing to the same place as they did in the previous workspace. Only thing that is pointing to a correct place is this notebook connection here in the data pipeline, because it is running the notebook within the same workspace, and those Fabric can handle automatically. But all the other connections, like for example these shortcuts and these invoke pipeline and invoke ADF activities, are pointing to the same place as they did in the previous workspace. And this is of course bad and looks messy, and now we would have to manually adjust these connections to point to these production resources instead of these development resources, and that is something that we don't really want to do. But luckily Fabric has a solution for this problem, and that solution is a variable library. We can set up a variable library to the dev workspace and use that variable library to dynamically point those connections to the right environment. And then when we do the deployment, we would switch on the production connections from that variable library so that in production those same connections would point to the production environment. And next, let's implement that variable library so that we can point those connections to the right place without doing those annoying manual adjustments after the deployment. Now in the dev workspace, let's create a new item and let's look for variable library. And here we have the variable library, and then I want to create a new variable library called variable library demo. And let's create that. And this will then create this variable library. And to this variable library, we can define new variables. Here we have a new variable. We would first have to provide a name for our variable, and then we would be able to add some notes to the variable if we want, and then we have to specify the data type for our variable, and then we set the default value for that variable. But what is cool here, we can define these additional value sets to this variable library. So for example, I can define here the production value set, so that for example, if we have one variable, then we can have 2 different values based on the environment for that same variable. And we can actually create here even more value sets if we want, so we don't have to stick with just 2. But because I only have 2 environments, the dev and prod, I will only use 2 value sets. So now let's fix first those shortcuts that we have in this lakehouse by using the variable library. Let's start from the animals table shortcut that is pointing to that other workspace. In order to fix that table shortcut, we would first need to know what kind of connection information is needed to be able to establish that shortcut. We can click this table here and then we can click manage shortcut. Here we can see that we have this target workspace ID and then we have this target item ID. Basically, this target item ID is the lakehouse ID to which this shortcut is pointing to. So in the development environment, we would need to use other IDs than in production. So we would need to dynamically set these. And here in the shortcut, we can see this edit variables button. And we can see that we can edit 3 variables for this shortcut. We can edit the target workspace, target item, and target path. So we would be also able to edit this path here as well. But that path stays the same in the production, so we don't need to touch that. But we would need that target workspace ID, then also that target item ID. And because this shortcut is already pointing to that dev animal workspace, this is the workspace ID for the dev, and the target item ID is the lakehouse ID for the dev workspace. And if you want to know another way of figuring out these IDs is by going to that animals workspace and opening up the lakehouse here. Here in the top bar, we can see the first ID. This is the workspace ID. And then after that, we have the lakehouse ID. But yeah, these are the IDs that we need for the dev connection. So let's go back to the variable library and let's set up those. Let's first set up the workspace ID here in the variable library. Let's give name to that variable, and then we are going to select the data type, and then we are going to set the default value, meaning the development value for this ID. And here we have the ID that is pointing to that development animal workspace. Then we want to set that lakehouse ID here. Let's create a new variable here, and then let's name that, and then let's select the data type for that, and then let's set the value for that variable that is pointing to that development lakehouse. Next, we would need the corresponding values from the production environment. So let's go to that animals production workspace, and then let's open up that lakehouse. And here again in the URL, we can see that workspace ID, and then we can see the lakehouse ID as well. So let's get those. Let's set the animals production workspace ID here, and then we need to set the animals production lakehouse ID as well. And now those are set. And now let's save our variable library, and then we can go back to the lakehouse, and then we can manage this table shortcut, and then we can select the target workspace here. And here we have that target workspace ID. Let's select that variable, and then we are going to select the target item that is going to be that lakehouse ID. And now I have selected those. And now we have fixed this first shortcut to use those values from the variable library, so that if we would deploy this shortcut to that production workspace, we would be able to switch on those production IDs so that this shortcut would actually point to that animals production workspace instead of that animals development workspace. So this should be all right now. Next, let's fix this other shortcut that we have here. Let's click manage shortcuts so that we can see what we need to fix. So we need to fix the target connection, and then we need to fix the target location. To the path we don't need to touch because that is the same path in the production and development, so it stays the same. And now when we are looking at this shortcut here, we can actually only see 2 strings here, so we cannot see any IDs here. But this target connection actually requires an ID, even though it is showing the connection name here. But this target location requires this kind of a URL that is pointing to that correct storage account in Azure. And how you would be able to know that this target connection here requires an ID and not this string? Well, version control is a very helpful feature for this. And I have actually attached this workspace to version control. And we can check out how does these shortcuts look in version control. And here we can see that lakehouse, and then we have this shortcuts metadata.json. And here we can see that for that file shortcut, we have this ID and not that string that can be seen in the UI. But for the location, we have that URL that we saw in the UI. So in that case, the UI can be a bit misleading. Here we can also see that for that table shortcut, we had those IDs there for the item ID and the workspace. And by the way, we cannot see variable library here in the version control yet because I haven't committed that here yet. But from the version control, we can get these values for dev to our variable library. So let's get this ID and let's get this URL here. So let's create 2 new variables to the variable library, and then we want to set names for those variables, and the both data types are going to be string. Then let's set the connection ID for dev, and then we want to set the target location URL for dev. And actually for the production environment, only thing that changes is the dev string there, and it will be prod. So I will already change that. But then we would need to figure out this connection ID, and that we can do in the connection settings if we open up settings here, and then we go to manage connection and gateways, and here we should be able to find those two connections that we are looking at there. And they are here. So here we have the dev and here we have the prod. And if we open up the settings, and here we can find the connection ID that we are looking for. So let's grab that and let's go back to the variable library and let's set that for prod. And now that should be done. Then again, let's save our variable library. Let's agree. And then let's go back to the lakehouse and let's click manage shortcut. And let's set our target connection and let's set variable for that. So we are going to set that connection ID, and then for the target location, we are going to set that target location variable for the variable library. And that is done. And now both of these shortcuts are pointing dynamically to the right environment. Before we continue with the video, I would like to note that I spent a ton of my free time creating these videos for you. That's why I would like to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more Mux Fabric content. This doesn't cost you anything, and I would highly appreciate that. Also, you can join my YouTube channel as a member and get some exclusive perks like early access to many of my videos, members-only videos, priority replying comments, and much more. And another way of showing support is to buy me a cup of coffee by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee link that can be found in the description. But now let's continue with the video. And now we have managed to fix both of these shortcuts so that they are pointing to the correct places based on the variable library variables. So that if we would do the deployment, we wouldn't need to manually adjust those shortcuts to point to the correct place. Next, I would like to tackle this notebook here so that we can make sure that it's reading that CSV data from the right place. So let's open up the notebook. Here we can see the hard-coded values for the workspace and lakehouse IDs, so that this is always reading data from that animals dev workspace. And we can run this notebook and see that everything works, but this is reading data from that dev. And there we can see that animals data that this notebook is reading. For reading variable library, we can actually use notebook utils in the notebook. We can run this notebook utils.variablelibrary.help to see more information about these functions that we have available here. Basically, we have two options here. We can either get individual variables from the variable library, or we can get the entire variable library as an object to this notebook. I will demonstrate both of these ways soon. Let's start with the first one. Here we have some code that uses this first function here. So we are saying notebook utils.variablelibrary.get, and then we are using this $syntax here to fetch variables from the variable library. And we are specifying which variable library, and then we are specifying which variable. And if we run this, we would be able to fetch those workspace ID and the lakehouse ID from the variable library. And here we can see those. So this method works fine. Then we have that other way where we would get that entire variable library as an object to this notebook. There we would say notebook utils.variablelibrary.get library, and then we specify the variable library name. And then I would be able to fetch variables from that library by using this object notation by saying that variable library dot the variable that I want to fetch. So let's run this and we should have the same variables that we had there. There we can see those variables, and I also printed the variable library so that we can see that variable library object there. And now let's fix the code that we have in this notebook and replace this code with this dynamic code that will get variables from the variable library, and we can also delete this cell here, and we can also delete these from here now. And now we can only run this, and let's see that this is able to fetch that development data from that development lakehouse. And this works fine as I expected. So now we have fixed this notebook as well. And by the way, when we fixed this notebook, we didn't need to add any new variables to the variable library since I already had that workspace ID and that lakehouse ID there. So I just wanted to clarify this so that it doesn't confuse anybody. And next, let's fix that data pipeline. So let's open up that data pipeline, and I want to fix this invoke pipeline activity that is pointing to that animals dev workspace. For that, we would need to dynamically replace this animals dev workspace, and then we would need to dynamically replace this pipeline here. And with this pipeline tool, we can actually check here locally already without using the version control what kind of things are expected here. But spoiler alert, again, we are needing some IDs here. So here we have that invoke Fabric pipeline activity, and here we can see that it is expecting to have pipeline ID, and it is also expecting to have workspace ID. So these are the two things that we need. But the workspace ID we already have, so we would only need to have that pipeline ID. And here we already have that pipeline ID for the development environment. So we can grab this and put that to the variable library. Let's close this and let's go to the variable library and let's create a new variable for that pipeline ID, and there we have that, and then we add the value for the development after choosing the data type, and here we have the development value, and then we have to go to the production, and again with the pipeline tool we can do the same trick, and here in the URL we can see the pipeline ID here and also the workspace ID like with the lakehouse. Next, let's go back to the variable library and let's set that value for the production pipeline. And now we have both of those values set. Then let's go back to the data pipeline and let's see how we can use these variable library values in that data pipeline. Let's go here and then let's click the canvas and we can see these library variables here. Let's open up that. And here we can actually bring in variable library values to this pipeline. We can click this new button here, and here we are able to choose the variable library that we want to use. And I want to note that these variable libraries can be also found within the scope of this workspace, so that we cannot reference any variable libraries that are outside of this workspace. So let's choose this variable library that we have in this workspace, and then we are going to select the variable that we need. So basically we need that workspace ID, so I'm going to select that, and let's then copy that name of that workspace ID here as variable name as well, and then let's create another one and let's select that same variable library, and now we need the pipeline ID, and let's also copy the name of that variable and add that as a name, and now we have those variables available here in this pipeline. And now let's go back to that activity, and here in the activity we can set dynamic content for this workspace by selecting this dynamic content that can be found here. So let's click that. And this should open up this dynamic content here. And here, by clicking these three dots here, we can find these library variables. And here we are able to choose those variables that we just defined to this pipeline. So I'm going to select the workspace ID because now we are setting the workspace ID here. And now that has been set. And then for the pipeline, we are also going to use the dynamic content and library variables. And there we are going to set that pipeline ID. And now those variable library variables have been set, and this invoke pipeline activity is pointing dynamically to the correct environment, so that we don't need to do any manual adjustments for this activity when we deploy this pipeline to production. With the notebook, we don't actually need to do anything because this is using a notebook in this same workspace that we just fixed. And within the same workspace, Fabric can handle those connections automatically so that it's pointing to the correct item after the deployment. But when using cross-workspace connections, it is not pointing them correctly, and you would need to use these variable library things to fix those. And what comes to this invoke ADF pipeline activity, to this we are not going to touch yet, but we are going to come back to this. So let's save this pipeline so that it's ready for deployment. And let's go back to the workspace. And now we could actually commit things to the source control. So let's commit all there and let's click commit, so that we can see how does the variable library look in the version control. And now those have been committed, and let's go back to the DevOps and let's refresh this. And here we can see that variable library and how does this look in the version control. So here we can see the production values, and then we are able to see also these default values that we are using for dev. And if we would add any nodes, they would be found here as well. And what comes to those shortcuts that we fixed, here we can see in the version control that now these item and workspace IDs are using these dynamic variable library variables rather than have those hard-coded values there that were present there previously. And now let's open up the deployment pipeline and let's do the deployment from the development workspace to the production workspace. And we can see that also variable library can be seen here in the deployment because we want to deploy it as well. So let's click deploy so that we will deploy those changes to the production. And then we can check, does everything work correctly in production so that things are pointing to the correct place. Now the deployment is done and let's go to the production workspace. Here in the production workspace we can see the variable library here. And now let's open up the lakehouse and let's check those shortcuts. Let's refresh this shortcut and it is actually still pointing in dev. Because there is actually one more thing that we need to do after the deployment. And let's go back to the workspace and let's open up the variable library. And here we can see that this production variable library is still using these same values as in dev. We would need to change this to use these prod values by selecting this set as active for these production values. Now we have swapped these to use these production values. And cool thing is that when we swap these, this won't change after the deployment. So that if we would deploy, for example, changes to this workspace or we would deploy new variables to the variable library, this would keep this production state active so that we don't need to change this after every deployment. We just need to do this once. But yeah, let's go back to the lakehouse and now we would need to click this update all variables so that these shortcuts would start to point to the right place. And now it is start to update those and this will take a little while and then they should point to the right place. And now they have been updated, so let's refresh this file shortcut and now we can see that it's pointing to production. And what comes to the animals table, we can also refresh that. And now we can see that this animals table is also pointing to production because in dev we have fewer rows. So for example, if we check this animals table in dev, we can see only 5 rows, but in production we have total of 10 rows. And now let's open up the notebook and let's check out that we get 10 rows here as well, because I also have 10 rows in that CSV file that we are reading with this notebook. And here we can see that we were able to get those 10 rows to the notebook as well. So we are reading that data from the correct place. And now let's also run our data pipeline to see that it runs that animals pipeline from that animals production workspace. So now it is running and it should run that pipeline shortly. And now this data pipeline has executed that other data pipeline in that animals workspace. So let's go to the animals production workspace and here we can view run history and now we can see that this has been executed once just recently. So this pipeline was able to execute that pipeline by using these variable library variables. And now we have managed to point all of the connections from these items to the correct place by using the variable library, so that we don't need to do those manual adjustments after the deployment. But we haven't fixed this invoke ADF activity yet. This is a tricky one, because I can show to you that this invoke ADF pipeline activity doesn't support dynamic content for the connection that defines which ADF it will run. We can actually use variable library for solving this issue here, but it will require some workarounds. And those workarounds I will show you in the follow-up video that I will be releasing right after this video, but that video will be members only. Also in that video I will discuss some strategies how to divide variables to different variable libraries, because I don't really like to use just one variable library in my environments. I like to have at least few, and I will open up my reasoning how I divide these variables to each variable library and what is the logic behind that. So if you want to learn more about variable libraries and those topics, join as a channel member and check out that video right after watching this one. Now I thank you for watching and see you in the next video.